You're watching The Good Word, where it's time for Under the Covers, in which Finlay MacDonald reveals the story behind a famous New Zealand book. This time it's Ask That Mountain by Dick Scott.
For every tale printed on pages and bound inside an alluring cover, there's another story. The story behind the book, how it started, struggled, what inspired it, who wrote it and why. To find out, we go under the covers. In 1881, a small village in Taranaki known as Parihaka finally succumbed to overwhelming military odds, a common enough occurrence in New Zealand's colonial history. But what marked Parihaka out as different was that the villagers had been practicing passive resistance to land confiscations some 7 decades before Gandhi employed similar tactics against the British in India. That this remarkable saga could be dismissed or distorted in official histories for so long is no accident either. It was a willful resistance by colonial mindsets to the truth about what really happened to Maori in the late 19th century.
Taranaki was very much, an isolated part of New Zealand. And also I think that the iwi sort of turned inward. I mean, they'd realised that they'd been so appallingly treated by the Pākehā community that they'd given up communicating with them. I mean, even Dick Scott found initially a high degree of suspicion of him when he started to ask questions.
Journalist Dick Scott stumbled on the Parihaka story almost by chance in the early 1950s. Bedbound with an adult dose of measles, he reached for an obscure volume he'd found in the library of a deceased estate.
And I, by chance, just chose one, an extraordinarily fat English lord's case, something like 600-odd pages, a welter of words, and just for the sake of something novel, I took this book, and reading it, they talked about some place I hadn't heard of.
The old legal transcript was a forgotten libel trial from 1886 in London involving a New Zealand cabinet minister. Amid the mass of verbiage, Scott became intrigued by references to a town described as an asylum for criminals and a fanatic named Te Whiti. Scott's historical instincts were aroused.
I got a bus to Taranaki and went into the village, and it was abandoned virtually. The houses were all empty, and I think there was a couple of old people living, and one woman, a middle-aged woman, invited me in for a cup of tea. And when I explained that I had a sympathetic approach, she then showed me the mountain, the hillock where the cannon had been aimed at the people. But she said, the one who knows is this old man, and she pointed to her grandfather or something. He's the one, and so I said, oh, wonderful. And he said, oh, no, I can't talk about it now. And I said, well, I'm very pleased to come back tomorrow morning. He said, oh, no, I won't be here in the morning. And so I got nothing from Parihaka when I first visited it, apart from seeing the hill where the cannon was.
Nevertheless, using official sources, Scott began to piece together the extraordinary story of Parihaka. On November 5th, 1881, government forces invaded the village. The prophet chiefs Tohu Kākahi and Te Whiti o Rongomai advocated passive resistance, and the invaders were met by singing children. They sacked the pā anyway, arresting Te Whiti and Tohu. In November 1954, Scott self-published his first version of what was then titled The Parihaka Story. Modest in design and print run, it was still greeted, as Scott later wrote in his memoir, either as a flood of light or a bursting stink bomb.
Criticism of the society was regarded as being, the voice of the Reds. Any criticism was regarded as communist. So there was no, the world was seen in bifurcated ways. It was them against us.
There wasn't a single review in New Zealand of that first book, except an Auckland Star sympathetic review by Robert Goodman, who was a friend of mine.
Why was that?
The attitude was still very defensive of Pakeha behaviour. They weren't going to have anything that's cast a slight on the wonderful pioneers we had.
To some critics, of course, the very name Dick Scott was enough. As editor of the union newspaper The Transport Worker, he'd already published a partisan account of the 1951 waterfront lockout. A lefty radical writing about old Maori grievances. In the New Zealand of the 1950s, an establishment backlash was almost inevitable. Why were they so resistant to somebody digging for a deeper truth?
Well, because it was a serious crime to put a question on the ownership of the land they were farming. If the suggestion that it had been taken wrongly was in their eyes, a crime.
So they were actually worried at a practical level.
Yes, yes.
But the Parihaka story proved resilient and popular. Copies regularly went missing from libraries, and even a Russian edition was published. By the 1970s, Scott had collected more research and was ready to write and publish the expanded version we now know as Ask That Mountain.
I got out the book in 1954, and the big shock was 20 years later, Parihaka people got in touch with me and asked me to put the book out again.
The extent to which he's drawn on primary sources, drawn on oral histories, and quoted them in the book is really, really impressive. It's a very, very rich source of primary material, and he really brings alive the voices of the people.
The updated book, with its famous cover painting by Michael Smither, was published to a very different reception in 1975.
The Taranaki paper, which had run a series of articles over several months declaring my first book a monstrous, foolish rubbish, now ran interviews with me and photographs of me, the unbelievable changes.
The book was a hit, and it can honestly be said to have influenced a generation of New Zealanders in their attitudes to local history and their understanding of Maori grievances and so-called radical motivations.
There was such a response that I had no other response like that for another book, and I had to be rather pleased with it.
And that's the last word from the Good Word for this time. Thanks to our panel and our special guest, James Milne, aka Lawrence Arabia. If you'd like to know more about the books and people featured on the show, or even how to form your own book club, go to our website at tvnz.co.nz and use the keywords Good Word. See you back here next time.